After this, I'm moving out. I've already packed. We'll talk later. The words hit me like ice water during what should have been the most beautiful moment of our daughter's wedding ceremony. Douglas leaned close to my ear as Victoria walked down the aisle in her grandmother's pearls, his breath warm against my cheek as he delivered his devastating news with the casual tone of someone discussing dinner plans. My name is Evelyn Sharp, and I'm 58 years old. For 30 years, I've been the devoted wife of Douglas Sharp, managing our home in Charleston, South Carolina, while he built his reputation as a successful commercial real estate developer. Today was supposed to be the culmination of everything we'd worked toward together, watching our only daughter marry the love of her life in the garden behind our antebellum home. Surrounded by 300 guests who'd come to celebrate this milestone with our family, I kept my face serene, my hands steady as they held my small bouquet of white roses. "Of course, dear," I whispered back, my voice carrying none of the shock that was racing through my veins. Douglas straightened his tie and turned his attention back to the ceremony, apparently satisfied that he'd delivered his bombshell without causing a scene. 3 rows behind us, I could see her. Leah Morrison, his 28-year-old secretary, sitting primly in a navy dress that I now realized was far too expensive for someone earning her salary. She'd been with Bright Hollow Development for 2 years, and I'd always thought her professional and pleasant during the few times we'd met at company events. How naive I'd been. As Victoria and Thomas exchanged vows under the magnolia trees, speaking words about commitment and faithfulness that now felt like mockery, I maintained my composure. The photographer captured moment after moment, Douglas and me standing together, smiling proudly as our daughter promised to love and honor her new husband. To everyone watching, we looked like the picture of marital success, the kind of couple who'd weathered 3 decades together and emerged stronger. But something cold and calculating had already begun forming in my chest. Douglas had chosen this moment, our daughter's wedding day, to announce his betrayal. He'd waited until I was trapped in public, surrounded by family and friends, when any emotional reaction would ruin Victoria's perfect day. He thought he'd cornered me, forced me into silent acceptance of his decision. What Douglas didn't know was that I'd seen this coming months ago, and I'd been preparing. The signs had started appearing 6 months earlier, though I'd initially dismissed them as midlife restlessness. Douglas began working later, claiming urgent projects that required evening meetings. His phone, once carelessly left on kitchen counters, now stayed glued to his side. He'd upgraded his wardrobe without mentioning it, trading his comfortable khakis for tailored suits that made him look younger, more vibrant. Our relationship had never been passionate in the Hollywood sense, but it had been steady, comfortable. We'd built Bright Hollow Development together, though Douglas received all the public credit while I managed the financial side from behind the scenes. I'd sacrificed my own career aspirations as a certified public accountant to support his dreams, handling our investments, estate planning, and tax strategies while he charmed clients and closed deals. For 30 years, I'd been the perfect wife, hosting dinner parties for potential investors, managing our household staff, coordinating family vacations, and ensuring Douglas never had to worry about mundane details like bill payments or insurance renewals. I'd raised Victoria while he traveled, celebrated his successes while downplaying my own contributions, and maintained our social calendar with military precision. But something had shifted after Victoria's engagement announcement last year. Douglas became distant, distracted. He'd stare at his phone during dinner, claiming to read industry news when I could see the reflection of text messages in his wine glass. He stopped mentioning Leah by name when discussing office matters, referring to her only as my assistant, with a careful neutrality that immediately raised my suspicions. 3 months ago, I decided to conduct my own investigation. It started small, checking our joint credit card statements more carefully, noting charges at restaurants I'd never been to, boutiques that sold women's clothing in sizes much smaller than mine. I discovered a second cell phone bill, paid from an account I'd never seen before. When Douglas claimed he was attending a real estate conference in Atlanta, I confirmed the event had been canceled 2 months earlier. That's when I hired Catherine Webb, a private investigator recommended by my longtime attorney, Harrison Phillips. Catherine was thorough and discreet, providing me with photographs, financial records, and a timeline that painted a clear picture of Douglas's affair. Leah Morrison wasn't just his secretary, she was his mistress, his confidant, and apparently his planned future. The apartment lease Catherine uncovered was particularly revealing. Douglas had signed a year-long contract for a luxury condo downtown, listing himself and Leah as occupants. The security deposit had come from a business account he'd opened without my knowledge, funded by money he'd systematically transferred from our joint investments. As I watched Victoria dance with Thomas during their reception, twirling in circles of ivory silk while guests applauded, I felt a strange sense of clarity. Douglas had underestimated me completely. He saw me as the passive wife who'd always accommodated his needs, who'd never question his decisions or challenge his authority. He had no idea what I was capable of when properly motivated. The revelation that shattered my remaining illusions came just 2 weeks before Victoria's wedding. I'd been reviewing our financial statements when I noticed irregular transfers. Significant amounts moved from our joint accounts to an investment fund I didn't recognize. When I called our financial advisor, Patricia Coleman, she seemed surprised by my inquiry. "I assumed you knew about the new portfolio Douglas established," Patricia said, her voice carrying a note of concern. "He specifically requested that all documentation be sent to his office address." That evening, I confronted Douglas directly. He was in his study reviewing contracts when I placed printouts of the unauthorized transfers on his desk. For a moment, his confident facade cracked, and I saw genuine surprise flash across his features. "Evelyn, these are just business investments," he said, but his voice lacked its usual certainty. "I'm diversifying our holdings to protect our retirement." "Our retirement?" I kept my tone level, professional. "These transfers are going to accounts with only your name attached, and according to Patricia, you've instructed that I be excluded from all communications regarding these investments." Douglas stood up, moving to the window that overlooked our garden. "You've always trusted me to handle the financial decisions. Why are you questioning me now?" "Because this isn't handling finances. This is hiding assets." I watched his shoulders tense as the truth settled between us. "I know about Leah, Douglas. I know about the apartment, the secret phone, all of it." He turned around slowly, and for the first time in our marriage, I saw him as a stranger. The man I'd loved and supported for 3 decades looked at me with calculation rather than affection, measuring how much damage control he'd need to manage. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. "I want honesty." The words came out harder than I'd intended. "I want to know how long you've been planning to leave, and I want to know why you're stealing from our joint accounts to fund your new life." Douglas straightened, and suddenly he was the successful businessman again, the man who'd built an empire through charm and determination. "I'm not stealing anything. Those funds represent my contribution to our marriage, and I have every right to protect my interests." "Your interests?" The audacity was breathtaking. "I've been managing our finances for 30 years. I know exactly what each of us contributed, and it's not what you think." That's when I saw the first flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Douglas had always assumed I was simply paying bills and balancing checkbooks, never realizing the sophisticated web of investments, trusts, and legal protections I'd woven around our assets. He'd never bothered to understand the complexity of our financial structure, because he'd never thought he'd need to. As I left his study that night, I knew our marriage was over, but I also knew that Douglas had made a critical error. He'd underestimated the woman who'd been quietly protecting and growing our wealth for 3 decades. The weeks leading up to Victoria's wedding became a careful dance of deception on both sides. Douglas continued his charade of the devoted father, enthusiastically discussing reception details and guest arrangements while secretly finalizing his escape plan. Meanwhile, I played the role of the overwhelmed mother of the bride, using wedding preparations as cover for meetings with Harrison Phillips, my attorney, and countless hours spent documenting our financial holdings. Harrison had been our family lawyer for 15 years, but this was the first time I'd met with him privately. His office overlooked Charleston Harbor, and I found myself staring at the sailboats while he reviewed the evidence Catherine Webb had gathered. "Evelyn, what Douglas has done constitutes marital misconduct under South Carolina law," Harrison said, spreading photographs and financial documents across his mahogany desk. "The secret transfers, the hidden apartment lease, the systematic depletion of joint assets, all of this supports your position in divorce proceedings." But I wasn't interested in a lengthy court battle that would inevitably become public knowledge. Douglas thrived on his reputation as a successful family man and community leader. His real estate empire depended on trust and relationships built over decades of careful image management. "I don't want to destroy him publicly," I told Harrison. "I want him to destroy himself." That's when we developed what Harrison privately called the surgical approach. Instead of fighting Douglas's asset transfers, we'd let him continue making them while ensuring he was actually transferring money he no longer legally owned. The key was restructuring our holdings before he realized what was happening. Over the next 10 days, I signed papers that moved the majority of our assets into irrevocable trusts, protected investment accounts, and legal entities that Douglas couldn't access without my explicit consent. Our family home, the vacation house on Kiowa Island, the investment properties that generated our rental income, everything was quietly shifted into structures that protected my interests, while leaving Douglas's recent transfers as evidence of attempted fraud. The most satisfying discovery came when Catherine uncovered the full extent of Douglas's financial planning. He'd been methodically moving money for months, believing he was securing his future with Leah. What he didn't realize was that most of the accounts he'd been funding were connected to assets I'd already protected through legal restructuring. "Your husband has essentially been stealing his own money and giving it to his mistress," Catherine explained with professional satisfaction. "When the divorce proceedings begin, those transfers will be viewed as dissipation of marital assets, which means he'll be required to reimburse the marital estate." Douglas's confidence during those final weeks before the wedding was almost amusing. He'd arrive home from his secret meetings with Leah looking pleased with himself, probably imagining how smoothly his transition would proceed. He'd established a new life, secured his finances, and timed his announcement to minimize my ability to interfere. At Victoria's rehearsal dinner, I watched him give a heartfelt speech about love, commitment, and the importance of family. He spoke eloquently about the marriage he and I had built, praising my dedication and support while guests applauded his apparent devotion. Later, I saw him check his phone repeatedly, probably coordinating final details with Leah about their post-wedding plans. The irony was exquisite. Douglas was celebrating his own destruction while believing he was orchestrating his liberation. 2 days before the wedding, I made my final preparation. In a safety deposit box downtown, I placed copies of all financial documents, evidence of Douglas's affair, and a detailed timeline of his asset transfers. I also deposited the divorce papers Harrison had prepared, along with a comprehensive asset list that would shock Douglas when he finally understood the scope of his miscalculation. On the morning of Victoria's wedding, I woke up before dawn and reviewed everything one final time. In a few hours, Douglas would deliver his carefully planned announcement, believing he held all the cards. He had no idea that I'd been preparing for this moment for months, that every move he'd made had been anticipated and countered. The wedding ceremony proceeded flawlessly, despite Douglas's devastating whisper. Victoria looked radiant as she promised to love Thomas through every challenge life might bring them, their words carrying weight that felt almost prophetic given the drama unfolding in the front row. I maintained my composure throughout the service, smiling at appropriate moments and dabbing my eyes with a handkerchief when Victoria's voice broke with emotion during her vows. After the ceremony, the photography session became a surreal exercise in pretense. Douglas and I posed together for family portraits, his arm around my waist as if nothing had changed between us. When the photographer requested a picture of just the parents, Douglas smiled warmly and pulled me closer, playing his role as the devoted husband perfectly. "Beautiful ceremony," Leah commented when she approached us during the cocktail hour, her voice carefully neutral. "Victoria looks absolutely stunning." "Thank you," I replied pleasantly, noting how Douglas's jaw tightened slightly when she spoke. We're so proud of her. The three of us stood there for a moment, an awkward triangle of civility masking the explosive truth beneath. Leah excused herself quickly, probably sensing the tension she couldn't quite identify. During dinner, Douglas delivered another performance worthy of an award. He stood to give the traditional father's speech, his voice strong and emotional as he spoke about watching Victoria grow up, about the pride he felt in the woman she'd become. He thanked me publicly for being the heart of our family and the woman who made all of this possible. The applause was thunderous, and several guests approached me afterward to comment on what a wonderful marriage Douglas and I had, how lucky Victoria was to have parents who clearly adored each other after so many years. Each compliment felt like a small blade, but I smiled graciously and accepted their praise while planning Douglas's downfall. As the evening progressed, I noticed Douglas checking his watch repeatedly. He'd probably promised Leah they'd leave together once the reception wound down, finally beginning their new life as a couple. Every few minutes, his eyes would find her across the room, and I could see the anticipation building in his expression. The moment I'd been waiting for came during the last dance. While Victoria and Thomas swayed to their wedding song, surrounded by family and friends who'd gathered to celebrate their love, Douglas leaned close to me again. I know this is difficult, he said quietly, but I think it's better this way. Clean break, no prolonged arguments or negotiations. I agree completely, I replied, my voice steady. A clean break is exactly what we need. Douglas looked surprised by my calm response, probably expecting tears or pleas for reconsideration. I'm glad you understand. I was worried you might make this complicated. Oh, Douglas, I said softly, turning to meet his eyes directly. I would never make things complicated for you. Something in my tone must have registered, because his confident expression flickered slightly. But before he could respond, Victoria and Thomas approached us, glowing with happiness and ready to begin their honeymoon departure tradition. As we waved goodbye to the newlyweds, Douglas standing beside me with rice in his hair and his arm around my shoulders for the final photographs, I felt a sense of completion. Victoria was safely married and departing for her honeymoon in Italy. The guests were beginning to leave, thanking us for a beautiful celebration, and Douglas was about to discover that his carefully orchestrated escape plan had been an elaborate trap of his own making. After the last guest departed and the catering staff finished cleaning up, Douglas and I found ourselves alone in our garden for the first time since his morning announcement. He'd loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, looking relaxed and pleased with how smoothly the day had proceeded. That went well, he said, surveying the remnants of Victoria's reception. She looked happy. She did, I agreed, then turned to face him directly. I believe you mentioned we needed to talk. Douglas's expression shifted, becoming more serious as he prepared for what he clearly expected to be a difficult but manageable conversation. Evelyn, I know this comes as a shock, but I think if we handle this maturely, we can minimize the disruption for everyone involved. I appreciate your concern for minimizing disruption, I said, reaching into my small evening purse to retrieve a manila envelope I'd carried throughout the entire wedding. I've prepared something that should help with that. Douglas looked puzzled as I handed him the envelope. What's this? Everything you'll need for your fresh start, I replied calmly, including some documents I think you should review immediately. His confusion deepened as he opened the envelope and began examining the contents. I watched his face carefully, noting the exact moment when his confidence began to crack. It started with a small frown as he read the first page, then progressed to genuine alarm as he flipped through the divorce papers Harrison had prepared. This is dated 3 weeks ago, Douglas said slowly, his voice carrying the first hint of uncertainty I'd heard from him all day. Yes, I filed them the day after I discovered your secret apartment lease, I explained pleasantly. Keep reading. The asset list is particularly interesting. Douglas's hands were shaking slightly as he reached the financial documentation. I'd included copies of every transfer he'd made, every hidden account he'd opened, and every penny he'd moved to fund his new life with Leah. But more importantly, I'd included the legal documents showing how those assets had been restructured months before his transfers began. "You can't do this," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "These accounts, these investments, I established them. The money came from our joint holdings." "Actually, Douglas, if you look more carefully at the dates, you'll see that I restructured our holdings well before you began your unauthorized transfers." I kept my tone conversational, as if we were discussing gardening rather than his financial ruin. "What you've been moving for the past 6 months is money you no longer had legal access to." The color was draining from his face as the implications sank in. The house, the business accounts, the investment properties, all protected through irrevocable trusts and legal entities that require my consent for any transactions. I watched him flip frantically through the papers, searching for some loophole or error he could exploit. "Your transfers to Leah's accounts constitute fraud under South Carolina law. Harrison has already filed the appropriate paperwork with the district attorney's office." Douglas looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Genuine fear mixed with dawning comprehension of how completely he'd been outmaneuvered. "How long have you known?" "Long enough to protect myself properly," I replied. "Long enough to ensure that your betrayal couldn't destroy what I've spent 30 years building." For a moment, we stood in silence among the scattered rose petals and empty champagne glasses, the ruins of Victoria's perfect wedding, serving as backdrop to the end of our marriage. Douglas's panic was immediate and complete. He stood among the remnants of our daughter's wedding reception, clutching the divorce papers while his entire world crumbled around him. The confident man who'd whispered his escape plan during Victoria's ceremony had been replaced by someone desperate and cornered. "Evelyn, please," he said, his voice cracking. "We can work this out. I'll call off the apartment. I'll end things with Leah. We don't have to destroy everything we've built." I looked at him with genuine pity. Even now, facing the complete collapse of his plans, Douglas still didn't understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. He thought this was about jealousy or wounded pride, something that could be smoothed over with apologies and promises. "Douglas, you chose to end our marriage the moment you whispered your announcement during our daughter's wedding ceremony," I said quietly. "You chose to steal from our joint accounts to fund your affair. You chose to hide assets and plan your future without any consideration for the woman who spent 30 years supporting your dreams." His hands trembled as he flipped through the financial documents again, probably hoping he'd misunderstood something crucial. "The business, our reputation. If this becomes public, it'll destroy everything." "It doesn't have to become public," I replied. "If you sign the divorce agreement and cooperate with the asset recovery process, we can handle this discreetly. But if you choose to fight these proceedings, every detail of your affair and financial misconduct will become part of the public record." Douglas's face went pale as the full scope of his predicament became clear. He'd planned his escape so carefully, but he'd never anticipated that his quiet, supportive wife might be planning her own counter-strategy. The woman he'd taken for granted for 3 decades had systematically dismantled his future while smiling graciously at wedding guests. "How did you know?" he asked desperately. "I've always known who you really are, Douglas," I said with finality. "The question is whether you're going to accept responsibility for your choices or make this even uglier than it needs to be." The aftermath unfolded exactly as Harrison had predicted. By Monday morning, Douglas discovered that his access to every significant account had been terminated. The business credit cards he'd used for his secret transactions were canceled, the investment portfolios he'd counted on were legally protected, and the apartment he'd leased for himself and Leah was being investigated for fraudulent funding sources. Leah Morrison submitted her resignation from Bright Hollow Development that same week, probably realizing that her association with Douglas had become a professional liability. The private investigator Catherine had documented their relationship thoroughly, creating a trail of evidence that would make any future employment in Charleston's tight-knit business community extremely difficult. Douglas attempted to salvage his situation by contacting our mutual friends and business associates, hoping to garner sympathy for his position. But word of his affair and financial misconduct spread quickly through Charleston's social circles, and the man who'd built his reputation on trustworthiness found himself increasingly isolated. The fraud investigation Harrison had initiated proceeded methodically. Douglas's unauthorized transfers were easily documented, and his attempts to hide assets actually strengthened the case against him. Within 2 weeks, he was facing potential criminal charges in addition to the civil proceedings. I, meanwhile, maintained my dignity throughout the process. I attended Victoria's post-wedding brunch as planned, graciously accepting congratulations from friends who hadn't yet heard about Douglas's departure. When asked about his absence, I simply explained that he was dealing with urgent business matters. The irony wasn't lost on me. After 30 years of supporting Douglas's career and reputation, I was now the one protecting the family name while he destroyed everything he'd claimed to value. His carefully planned escape had become a public humiliation that would follow him for years. By the time Victoria returned from her honeymoon, Douglas had quietly settled the divorce agreement rather than face a public trial that would have exposed every detail of his betrayal. As I sit in my garden 6 months later, watching the magnolias bloom where Victoria danced on her wedding day, I realized that Douglas's betrayal was actually a gift. It freed me to discover my own strength and independence after decades of living in someone else's shadow. Sometimes the most devastating betrayals become the foundation for our greatest victories.